Mother praying over him, the time she slapped his face because he twirled one too many times in front of his female cousins. He was the best twirler of them all, the best somersaulter of all of them. "You're her only son," said his father. Baxter likes the cold of Canada. Even though he was born in the tropics, he droops in the island's tropic heat. The island where he grew up, hemmed in by ocean he could walk to on all sides if he had time enough. The island hemmed in by aunts and uncles and cousins and friends of cousins and aunts and uncles who all knew his mother, knew his father, knew when he woke up, when he went to bed, when he walked down a different street than usual just for a change. And uncles and cousins and friends of cousins, aunts and uncles who liked to remind him about the time his mother's lace-trimmed handkerchief fell out of his pocket at school, and they never let him forget it. He wanted to be Captain Nemo and travel far, far away. "Nemo?" asked his Aunt Araminta. "Nobody. I don't want anybody to know me," he said. She said. "Mobilis and mobili," he said. "Eat your conch," she said. He misses crunching his teeth into Araminta's cracked conch. As he chews his stowed-away supply of congealed pierogies, he also misses his mother's black-eyed peas and rice, curried goat, his mother's souse and johnny cake. His mother stands over him as he sneaks his dinner, even though she lives so far away. "Why do you have to eat with your lip like that?" she said, while he bites another piece of pierogi with his teeth. "Like what?" he asks. "Like that," she says, "like a woman." Maybe his jaws moving up and down could smother out her voice. On a table in the back of the house, the thorny lemon tree outside the window, his father scribbles out some sentences for next Sunday's sermon, then tucks his pencil behind his ear. Baxter sucks out the inside of the pierogi. "Lord, give me faith and patience," says his mother, her hands on her hips. "Stop doing that thing with your mouth." She pulls out her Bible. "Read to me." He has hallucinations from not getting enough sleep. And so this passage illustrates that. And just to let you know, Mad Mary is the nickname of the conductor. Esme is a little girl who's also on the trip. The book that backer. Mad Mary confirms it. A mudslide has trapped them in the mountains. The train is already 14 hours late. While Esme waits outside the door, Baxter sits on the toilet briefly, his bowels squeezing out nothing but air, and flips open the folded French postcard he found. The men on the postcard are not lying with each other in the dark, but in bright sunlight. He tucks it back in his breast pocket. Back outside, he slips his book, The Scarab from Jupiter, out from his locker. Esme traces the scarab imprinted on the cover. "Pretty," she murmurs. He pulls out the mattress for the seat in the smoker. "Maybe try to sleep," he says to Esme. Esme lies flat on her back on the sofa, her body stiff and her eyes wide open. He plants himself on a stool at the end of the aisle, the curtained tunnel of sleeping people in their sections snoring ahead of him. His head nods, then jerks awake. A perfectly ordinary tabby cat swirls around his feet, winding its snaky, muscled tail around his calf, then disappears when he blinks twice. His hand lifts and moves in a circle, wiping out an ashtray hovering in the air before him. One of the berth curtains swells, then breaks open before he can even bring over the ladder, and a lady he's never seen before leaps down in a shiny dressing gown, the dressing gown billowing out in butterfly wings. She ignores him as she creeps down the aisle. She tiptoes to another berth 2 sections down, parts the curtain, and slips inside. She doesn't care what he thinks. None of them do. And whom would he tell? Mad Mary? Laughable. Too bad the lady tiptoes with seagull's feet. The passengers toss and snore in their berths, loud now without the sound of the train rumbling and rattling over the tracks. The night calm and strange enough for him to contemplate reading his book. In the dim light, he flips through the pages of The Scarab from Jupiter. The plucky group of Egyptologists has been abducted to Jupiter, and they sit huddled in a cave in the center of Scarab City, filled with its pyramids of gold. The Egyptologist who had the scarab in his ear is a picked clean skeleton now, the scarab's larvae having eaten his brain and eaten its fill. Baxter swipes at his leg to knock off the beetle creeping up his trouser leg. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzette, for that reading. I'm just so glad that you decided to write a book that you wanted to read, and the rest of us now get to read it too.
Now, we would like to welcome you to please join us, welcoming our three panelists, Dr. Stephen Maynard, Dr. Kristen Mariah, and Dr. Chloe Savoie-Bernard to the stage.
And as we welcome them, we will also just give a little bit of introductions for who we have with us today. I know Suzette already gave one kind of for Dr. Stephen Maynard, but I just want to say when we found out that he helped consult on this book and he also is a professor here at Queen's, we were just so excited to have him join us. So thank you so much for coming.
Next, for Dr. Kristen Mariah, she is an assistant professor in the English department at Queen's. Her research interests include sound studies and Black feminist performance, in particular the circulation of African American performance within the Black diaspora and its influence on the formation of national identity. We are looking forward to hearing from Dr. Mariah's multidisciplinary approach to literature as it relates to Meyer's text.
And then, last but not least, we have Dr. Chloe Savoie-Bernard, and she also teaches at Queen's in the French and Cultural Studies departments, and she focuses notably on contemporary feminism studies in Quebec and also on Black studies, and we're just so excited to hear, again, your insights on this text. And also, Suzette, if you want to join them up here, we'll invite you as well.
And finally, we also have two of our classmates, Fiona and Rose, here to help us facilitate this discussion. We will start with any discussion and questions that the panelists may have for one another. And then Rose and Fiona will pose a few of their own questions that they have curated prior to the event before welcoming questions from the audience. We are excited to hear from members of the audience for this portion, but we do ask that you try to keep your questions as succinct and clear as possible. And I will now hand it off to Rose and Fiona.
Hi, it's so good to be in front of you again. Let me introduce Rose. Hello. And I guess without further ado, we'll pass it on to our fabulous panel. Yes. If you guys have any burning questions for each other, or if you would like to interrogate each other about what you thought about Suzette Meyer's book, or if you'd like to ask her anything, we'd like to just kick it off. We would love for this to, we're mainly interested in what you guys think about, and we want you to just be able to freely think out loud about it. So we do have guiding questions for your discussion if this feels too much pressure to just tell you to start talking. But if you have any burning questions, we'd love for you to start.
You know, I am so fascinated with the archival research that you conducted for this book, and I'm wondering if you could talk about it a little bit more. And so I know that you consulted with Stephen, but I'd also love to hear about how archival research impacted your work.
When I first started writing this book, I was super naive, and I thought, oh, I'll find everything I need in a history book, and there was no one history book that had the information I needed. I also...
I'm going to hand this to you.
Oh, thank you. Okay. I was super naive, and I thought that everything I needed would be, I'd be able to find it in a history book, and that was just not the case. Books of history that I could find about sleeping car porters were useful, but they didn't give me the minutia that I needed. So the day-to-day, I needed to know the smells, the sounds, the textures, all those kinds of details, and those were just not available. And so what ended up happening was I just started visiting the places where there were historically large black communities who were associated with railways. So I visited Vancouver, but it sounds like it was methodical and well planned out, and it just absolutely was not. It was just me kind of going to these places and saying, you know, what have you got? And so, especially in Winnipeg, it turned out that there was a series of transcribed interviews that somebody had done in the 1980s with sleeping car porters. And so that was a great start. I thought that would have been it. I thought that would have been all I needed. But what I learned was that sleeping car porters were historically very protective of their reputations and of the reputation of the job, and that they didn't necessarily talk about what the job was about. They didn't talk about it in detail because they had that reputation they had to maintain for their communities of it being the greatest job ever and them, you know, being in control. When in reality they were suffering like daily humiliations all the time, and they were terribly paid and all kinds of things. So, you know, I think maybe one of the weirdest moments for me, but a powerful moment that kind of embodies how difficult this all was, you know, was going to an archive in Winnipeg, going to the archives of the provincial archives in Winnipeg, and asking, you know, the archivist, one of the archivists, if, you know, if he had a picture of the interior of working class homes, of a working class home in the 1920s. And he said to me, yes. However, the problem was the only time the interiors of working class homes were recorded in photo, in the photo medium, was when they were criminal scenes. So literally, you know, I would see, because I had questions like, well, did people have light bulbs? Did they, you know, could you get water from a faucet? Like those, you know, what kind of lino? What kind of pots? And so there's a kitchen, and there's a light bulb, and there's the sink, and there's a dead body in the front. And, you know, so it was just, and then criminal records, which you know all about, you know, criminal records, court records, police records. They were the places that I was going to find this information. So, you know, it was not methodical. It took a really long time. A lot of it was accidental. But it was like repeatedly over and over again falling down some really magnificent rabbit holes. You know, and just, like, I remember one time being in an archive and just going through all the microfiches having to do with the year 1925 and just hoping there was something. And there usually was, you know, it just wasn't what I expected. So I don't know if that answers your question at all.
It does, thank you.
So are the archive like the bones of your novel? And then, so are the archives the bones of your novel? And then what about the fiction? How can you, how do you work between fiction and archive, and fiction and facts?
Okay, yeah. Is this working?
No.
Okay. So the way, like I said, this is my first historical fiction. It maybe is my last because it just about killed me. And what I ended up doing was relying a lot on that whole idea of critical fabulation. So the way I understand that is, and Saidiya Hartman talks about it in her essay, Venus in Two Acts, I believe it is called. And it's very intimidating being on a panel with an actual historian. I have to admit, an archivist. It's very, I'm so full of bullshit. Anyways, so basically what I did was I figured out, okay, what do we know? And then my understanding of critical fabulation is that, you know, when there is history that is irretrievable, when there are records that are irretrievable, history that's irrecoverable, as a fiction writer, what I can do is I can connect the dots. So if this thing happened historically, that thing happened historically, and the gap is in here, as a fiction writer, I'm going to make up the history, but within the parameters of what was historically possible. And so, you know, for me, the holy grail was trying to find a sleeping car porter who was queer, and that was hard enough. And then what I really wanted to find was a sleeping car porter who was queer, who slept with a passenger on a train. And that was the hard part. And so having to, you know, dig around to find evidence of that, I eventually did. So there's the whole story of Sumner Wells, who was an American diplomat who propositioned sleeping car porters on a train from, I don't know, Washington to Jasper or something like that. And nobody slept with him. Nobody took him up on it, and he lost his job. But, I knew, of course, it's possible. So the relationship between the history and the fiction is that the history it's sort of the shell, or it's the scaffolding, and then the fiction is what I'm attaching to the scaffolding. I don't know if that's the way to do it, but it's how it worked for me with this book.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Could I maybe pick up on the fiction and history thing? And I don't know whether we were supposed to do this. I actually prepared a little something. It's very short. Can I read it? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
My introduction to the sleeping car porter came 5 years ago when I received an out-of-the-blue email from Suzette about a novel she was working on, which she described as set in the 1920s about a gay black sleeping car porter. She wondered whether I'd ever encountered any similar person in my research into the queer history of early 20th century Toronto. Could Baxter have really existed? I introduced Suzette to Davis. Davis was a black porter for the Grand Trunk Railway, in his 40s, married, a Baptist, and in 1920 he was arrested for an act of gross indecency with another man. And given the fragmentary nature of the archival record, talking about archives, I couldn't tell you much more than that at the time. Imagine my delight when Suzette sent me a copy of the finished novel, and on the dedication page I read, "For Davis." Davis seems to resemble most closely to me, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the novel's Edwin Drew, the handsome, broad-shouldered object of Baxter's romantic, erotic longings. And inspired by the honor that Suzette bestowed upon Davis, and in anticipation of this evening, I did a bit more digging.
Oh.
So in the notes at the back of the novel, Suzette says she's tried to stick to the historical facts. And the life of the real life Davis, can you be a real figure, historical figure? You were once a real life figure. Right?
Yeah.
Would suggest that in fact she has. Davis immigrated to Canada from the US in 1908. The census identifies him as West Indian and as an alien. This administrative denigration of immigrants is slightly subverted in the novel, where the aliens are to be found not from the West Indies, but in the weird tales Baxter likes to read about Martians and beetles from Jupiter. Davis's sexual liaison occurred in the basement lavatory of the Grand Central Hotel, just a few blocks from Toronto's Union Station, and the rail yards where sleeping car porters prepared Pullman cars. Early in the novel, Baxter also has a near sexual encounter with a man in the toilets at the bottom of a hotel near the train station. In another instance of art imitating history, Baxter later has a hot hookup with Edwin in a back alley. And I should say right now, so that you know this, don't be surprised when you discover that I am totally stealing Suzette's line. Baxter's hands wet with Edwin Drew, his fingers dripping with love. Baxter, Edwin, and Davis searching for moments of pleasure, perhaps just before or just after an exhausting transcontinental train run of grinding humiliations served up by white passengers and bosses. So racism, but also the sustaining bonds of black co-workers and communities. So I discovered that Davis roomed in a lodging house on Bellwoods Avenue in Toronto, along with at least one other GTR sleeping car porter by the name of Samuel, who emigrated from the West Indies in 1891. The house was operated by a couple, also from the West Indies, Harry, who worked as a chef for the GTR, and his wife, Beatrice. Beatrice, this couple actually puts me in mind of the retired porter and his wife in the novel, who run a house friendly to porters near Montreal's Windsor Station. The census lists Beatrice's occupation as none. But we know from the novel's depictions of the domestic work of women who ran boarding houses for porters in Winnipeg, Montreal, and Toronto that Beatrice no doubt cooked, washed, and ironed for Harry, Davis, and Samuel. Black women's labor essential to keeping the porters on their feet and on the job. And here, fiction makes up for the gendered omissions of the historical record. But the novel's contribution, I think, is to be found far beyond its fidelity to the facts, which it does do. It is, I would suggest, a crucial intervention in at least 3 different historiographies: Black history, queer history, and labor history. In its quiet way, the novel calls out the persistent whiteness of so much queer historical writing, at the same time as it insists that Black and labor historians take seriously the central place of sexuality in the past. Suzette's rich historical imagination has accomplished what none of these historiographies have been able to do on their own. She has fabulated into existence a singular history that reclaims and weaves together diverse and, up until now, mostly divergent pasts. Suzette gives to Baxter, and she restores to Davis, the fullness of their multiple identities as Black, working class, and queer. So yes, there is the Giller. But to my mind, The Sleeping Car Porter should also walk away with the prize for the best book in Canadian history.
I got an A+. Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. Oh, that's so, that's huge. That's huge. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow.
More questions?
Yeah,
have
because
something. No.
yeah, but like now I feel bad to do it. Yeah, because we were asked to do like a 5-minute little word, and I don't know. I kind of wanted to answer to the novel by a poem.
Oh.
But I'm French, so I did write it in English. So it's an English poem by a French poet. So we don't know what it's wording, but here it goes. How can a body be alive without being seen? This is a losing battle. Here, see me standing in front of your eyes, my body marking my words. I am not still, nor are you even seated. Life is a constant flow. Your organs are perpetual dance to ensure that you are afloat, breathing. Baxter, the sleeping car porter, knows he has to be invisible to be a good employee. The urgent and vital need to remain unseen while seeing, witnessing everything around him, while attending to all the little needs of the passengers. The faster, the better at being efficient, tidying up beds, hoping not to get fired, changing wet towels for dry ones, hoping not to get fired, making sure everybody's shoes shine, bringing glasses of water and roast beef sandwiches to everybody, hoping not to get fired. How can a shadow carry so many objects? How can a shadow carry so many burdens? Baxter works with a growling stomach without rest. He works trembling at the thought that somebody might see his sweat, might see him shivering, might see his body showing the sign of his humanity. Keep your hunger to yourself, your tiredness to yourself, your desire to yourself. He cannot afford to be seen as a man. His self has to be tamed, has to be masked, has to be suppressed, no sharp movements. A double bind impossible to resolve, to be expect to keep the train in a perfect state without anybody really noticing you are there. How can you survive at your own disappearance? But Baxter is not complying to his erasure. Behind the yes sir, yes ma'am, there is a proliferation of desire of hopes. The fatigue cannot destroy the radicality of his imagination. The self is a garden where the inviolable secret of the mind can move, can blossom. On a moving train, nobody wants to see the car porter, but his mind is plotting. navigating through tangible past, building his future through the waves of his mind. His body stiff from the stillness, teeth clenched, but only to keep his dream inside, to preserve them for himself. His unmoving but still moving body knows how to feed his own truths.
Oh, thank you. It's beautiful.
I did my best.
Oh, it's beautiful.
I think it's my turn now. I just went full English professor, so I apologize for the dramatic shift that's about to take place. In the Sleeping Car Porter, we learned about Baxter's. In the Sleeping Car Porter, we learn about Baxter's passengers, colleagues, and traveling companions in fits and starts. Over time, as their well-oiled itinerary begins to unravel and the layers fall away. Suzette Meyer puts them into sharper and sharper relief as Baxter grows closer to them, as the forced, dreamlike, erotic, and occasionally nightmarish intimacy of the sleeper car becomes unavoidable. Some of the passengers we meet are people, some are hallucinations, some are mere objects. We meet the messenger on day one while traveling from Montreal to Sudbury. Meyer writes, as Baxter labors through the sleeping car, his forehead and armpits misting with perspiration, he finds wedged in tight among the berths an old copy of The Messenger, world's greatest Negro monthly. The magazine sears his hands. He could be fired for just being in the same room as this rag. Baxter rolls up the magazine, stuffs it into the front of his trousers, and jumps off the train, jams it to the bottom of a garbage can, and heaps the rest of the trash on top. He jumps back into his car. So The Messenger was a radical black magazine founded in 1917 by leftist activists and editors A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen. And if The Messenger wasn't real, we would have to make it up. It was a socialist magazine that managed to feature critiques of figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, alongside new work by Bright Lights of the Harlem Renaissance, and lengthy updates about the goings-on of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. In World War I, it was subject to a postal ban in the United States, and A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen were jailed for their editorial activities. And I'm always encouraging my students, who are in this room, to dig through black newspapers and periodical databases that the Queen's Library subscribes to, and this is one of the kind of treasures that I hope that they will find. For Baxter, the copy of The Messenger he finds brings to mind Eugene Grady, a politically active porter who happens to be the cousin of his former lover, Edwin Drew. Eugene is an outspoken Howard University-educated lawyer who was summarily dismissed in Winnipeg on day 3 of their journey, while most likely shouting obscenities, cursing, and crackling the air in electric blue. Illicit reading material and ephemera are intertwined with political and erotic desire throughout the Sleeping Car Porter. I like to imagine that the forbidden sense of agency and power Eugene finds in the pages of The Messenger find their erotic likeness in the postcard of naked men that sits folded next to Baxter's heart. They remind me of the sociality of the spaces Samuel Delany describes in his memoir, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. In the Sleeping Car Porter, both the postcard and the magazine are powerfully printed materials, cracking with forbidden energy, waiting to be read, analyzed, and perhaps acted upon. And later, Mrs. Tupper, the romance novelist, boldly claims a postcard as her own in order to save Baxter, explaining that she was using it as a bookmark. Erotic postcards, illicit reading material, and clandestine encounters abound on Baxter's route. And in their defense of Baxter, all of the porters claim to have found erotic postcards hidden around the train. And early on, a male passenger shows Baxter a much-thumbed postcard of naked women, forcing Baxter to rack his brain for the right non-response. In this case, a lame joke about husbands forgetting to buy them coats. This forced intimacy and the power dynamics they heighten are not accidental. George Pullman, the early innovator of sleeping cars, modeled his train service on enslavement-era servitude and specifically hired black men to work as porters for his company. The kinds of performances that Baxter and his colleagues engage in to survive their work are rooted in fantasies of minstrelsy. What good are you then, an aggressive pulp and paper executive asks him when Baxter declines to sing or dance like a minstrel show darky or automaton. Edwin Drew, the best instructor in the country, tells him to behave on train like an automaton at a carnival, but don't Uncle Tom it. We know that Black railway employees were initially prevented from joining the Canadian Brotherhood of Railway Employees, the most powerful railway union in Canada. The union's constitution said that only white people could become members. But in 1917, Black Canadian porters formed the first Black railway union in North America. At the same time, A. Philip Randolph, the editor of The Messenger, advocated for the rights of Black railway porters, eventually founding the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1928. Black Canadian porters would not become members of the larger Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union until 1939, 10 years after we meet our man Baxter. But before, during, and after unionization, Black porters like Baxter modulated their voices and desires. Baxter and his colleagues are keen readers and critics. They must read the room, passengers, images, objects, and text correctly in order to maintain their livelihood. And in The Sleeping Car Porter, the subversive connections between Black radical print culture, pulp fiction, and pornography move in and out of focus. Baxter's colleagues and passengers all have strong opinions about literature, at one point claiming that novels are just lies and distraction while living off the proceeds of such fiction, clamoring over the rumored presence of a male science fiction writer, bristling publicly at the tales of man-eating scarab beetles that Baxter tells while privately devouring pulp fiction like the scarab from Jupiter. Reading rightly signals a way of fumbling towards orthodoxy. Eugene Grady insists that space story writers are all liars, cowards, and sissies anyway. And here Eugene's use of the term sissies calls to mind scholar Charles Nero's assertion that reading can make you queer. Baxter, with his love of science fiction and smut, certainly fits the bill. But as Baxter himself might ask, what's wrong with that? Don't shoot the messenger.
Is this working? There it is. There it is. All right. Thank you all for your great readings, your great contributions. They've certainly changed the way I've seen the novel and evolved. And I have a question more so about your research and your approach to this. It seems like a lot of work went into this, the 18 years, the research, all of that effort. And I'm sure that us all as scholars understand that process between writing and the gathering of information and how important both are, and even then how the amassing of information can become such a roadblock to our writing. And I have to ask, especially given the almost poetic nature of the writing, how does one balance that fine balance of research and art? How did you approach that throughout your writing process? And how did you balance that need for accuracy and also that need to tell that story that was within a little?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I realized, I remember talking to Cheryl Fogo, who's a historian, novelist, playwright in Calgary who specializes in Black Alberta history. And she was one of the first people I talked to when I was thinking about writing this book. And I said, how will I know when I'm done the research? And she said, probably what will happen is that you'll start circling back to the same resources, the same sources over and over and over again. And that's what happened. And that's when I felt comfortable, or I thought, okay, I know enough to know when I can break the rules, because I do have a creative license, which is laminated at home, which allows me to, at a certain point, this is fiction. This is a story. It's got to move in a particular way. It's not a documentary. And so the thing is that the research wasn't necessarily separate from the creative work. So much of the creative work was generated by the research. So I remember there was one day that was it was a beautiful day where I found a digitized version of a Henderson's directory. I don't know if people know what Henderson's directories are. Maybe it's just from the West. I'm not sure. Anyway, so the Henderson's directory is like the white pages. Of course, there are a lot of people here who won't know what white pages are either. So it's basically a phone book with addresses, but the Henderson's directory is like white pages on steroids because it gives the name of the person, the address, however other way you can contact them, and their profession. And it says, well, these are the businesses that were in the neighborhood, and these people lived on these streets, et cetera, et cetera. And so by, if you read through the Henderson directory in, a careful enough way, you can find out who was neighbors with whom. And that way I discovered, for example, that there were a whole bunch of porters who lived on Sutherland, for example, and their neighbor was Mrs. Lesiak, and that was her name, Mrs. Lesiak. She didn't even get a first name. So that day was brilliant because I woke up, I got my cup of tea, I had a bit of breakfast, and I sat with and I hadn't brushed my teeth, and I hadn't changed out of my pajamas, and I thought, I'm just going to do a bit of Henderson's directory. And so I was just just kind of scrolling and taking notes, and suddenly it was 4 p.m. And my body was just shut down from not moving and not eating and not going to the toilet. But it was a beautiful day because I discovered so much about that place and that time. And it was through doing that research that I discovered Mrs. Lesiak, and that Mrs. Lesiak was actually boarding people and that those kinds of really interesting details. So there were certainly aspects where the historical research was distinct from the creative component, but as I did more and more research, they became one, and they started generating each other. And finding Davis, you telling me about Davis, that was like it was fireworks. Suddenly the story made sense to me. And so, I don't know. I think, does that answer your question? Kind of? There's no, that's just my process as well. Like, I'm sure other people have different ways of.
I mean, absolutely. I think that this novel, what's so interesting about it, especially the way we studied it in class, is how intricate the process was and how as important as that process of reading, I guess. So I'm really appreciative of your answer, your well thought out answer.
One thing that was excellent for us as the group that presented on your book is your works cited at the end. That was I just want to thank you formally for putting that in. This next question is for Dr. Maynard, and I'd also like to clarify if any one of you have like a response to something that was said, we would love for you to have it, and we can hold off. But in the meantime, Dr. Maynard, you said that you were teaching this book in your class, and I'm wondering if there were any like new aspects of the sleeping car porter, or did you find renewed excitement in teaching it to your class, and did they bring out any other meanings into it, or did you want to do research into it more because of their questions or because of any interactions you had?
Well, I was saying to Suzette that I'm not actually teaching the novel. I wouldn't do that. We don't do that upstairs from the English department. But what we are doing in our class, it's actually going on right now, so I'm not going to be able to give you the final answer yet, is it's a project that students are writing. There are 150 of them, and they're reading the novel and trying to think about what are the connections between historical fact and fiction, between a novel and a more academic piece of history, a book, an article, and what can the novelist do that the historian can't, and I suppose vice versa. So I don't really know yet, because I think there's some of them are here. The paper's due in a week, isn't it? And I'm really looking forward to their ideas about, because we've been reading mostly academic stuff, right? So reading this novel about a history that hasn't appeared in the historiography in the ways that I think Suzette combines those three, the queer history, the black history, and labor history. I'm interested to hear what these students make of that intersection.
Me too.
Thank you. And to that point, I guess my reading of the novel sort of evolved throughout the semester and throughout even just the past half hour, I guess. I was a bit confused by the novel's point, I'll admit, and I was really frustrated by that confusion. I didn't understand it, and through your reading especially, I sort of saw Baxter as this unmoored character. You know, he's so untethered. We don't know his family. We know the parts of his family, but we don't quite understand him. And we know the parts of his life, but only insofar as they relate to work. And there's, at that same time, he's so tied down. He's so completely trapped in this position and his current life, I guess. And at that same time, I saw this huge, even throughout your reading, just this ability for the body's capacity to be abject, to be both disgusting and both the most intimate place for connection. And so that sort of leads me to a question for all of the panelists, really, is how's your reading evolved from this? And even Suzette, through your process as being shortlisted and your process of discussing this novel and dealing with so much scholarship around the novel, how has your relationship to the text sort of evolved throughout this process?
I don't know if it's evolved so much as because I'm being asked a lot to talk about why I made the choices I made, I'm having to think really, having to think seriously about my writing process and the development of character and what kind of writer I am. And I think this is so not a plot-driven book. It's more of a psychological study, a meditation on a character in a certain, at a certain point in his life. And that's really interesting for me. I don't think it's necessarily interesting for every reader. Some people are more plot-oriented. So, and the other, I have to confess, I've had to do a lot of reflection on what does external success mean and external validation, because I wrote 5 books before this, and so what was wrong with those? kind of, but at the same time, I know, I've been on enough juries to know that, often and we were talking about this earlier, the choice of the best book is often from a lot of negotiation and compromise, and so it's not necessarily the best book. So I'm not gonna let this get to my head, especially because I know by the time the long list for 2023 is announced, I'm gonna be stale bread. So anyway, so but I think part of the, all joking aside, part of the writing of a book is learning when to give it away. And so when I wrote it and published it, it was like, there's a kite and I cut the string and now it belongs to other people and it's going to do what it does and be read in the way it's read, and that's all okay. And now I'm on to the next project. And so I'm more concerned about the next project, but this has definitely been a lesson in what kind of writer I am and what kind of a public writer I am, I suppose. Yeah.
And what is the next project? Can we know?
Yeah. I don't know. I think that I know for sure it's going to be a book about a woman. That's all I know at this point. I was going to write a haunted house novel because I've been wanting to do that for so many years, but I wrote a short story about a haunted house and got it out of my system, so I'm not interested in that anymore. So I don't know, talk to me in 5 years, and I hope I have an idea. But yeah, I don't know. It's terrifying.
You heard it here first, folks. The next novel will be about a woman.
Yeah.
You can take that to the bank. Sorry. One thing that really entranced me about your book is I've seen you elsewhere. You've talked about your affinity for horror and your affinity for, specifically, I remember you talked about The Haunting of Hill House, which is also one of my personal favorite novels. And you incorporated that so well into several passages where the train car just cannot be warm. And Baxter, it's this very good characterization of this space itself as a figure of animosity. And I guess I was just wondering if the other intertextual or allusions that you made in the book were Pulp Fiction, specifically Weird Tales. I actually took a course on Pulp Fiction, I remember last year, and I got very excited doing archival research because I thought, I'm going to find the Scarab of Jupiter. We have a very good archive here. I'm going to find the stories. And if if you can give us, what's your relationship to the 1920s pulp scene? Like, is that part of your love story with horror and with weirdness and with abject, or
I
was
think
it specific?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's more about me doing time travel to figure out, okay, if I was in the 1920s and I was a man and I lived in Montreal, like it was getting ridiculous. But I thought, okay, if I lived in the 1920s, what would I be interested in? I sure couldn't watch Netflix, but I do know that I am interested in books like The Haunting of Hill House. And so I thought, okay, what would people have been reading? Well, Dracula was around. The Beetle by Richard Marsh was around, and that was a book that sold way better than Dracula, but it fell out of favor because it's super racist for one, that's among the other reasons, although it's a really interesting book. I thought, I'd be reading weird tales. And I referenced specifically an issue where, there's a short story called The Chemical Brain that Baxter reads, and there's an automaton, there's a robot in that book, or in that story, and so Baxter kind of takes on the robot from The Chemical Brain. It's also an issue that, one of H.P. Lovecraft's earlier stories appeared. So it was, part of, there's a kind of joke when it comes to the academy and academic research, for example, research me search, for example, and thinking of this book as an academic project, which I did, which I do, in addition to it being a creative project. I don't think they're necessarily that distinct. I had to dig deep to figure out, okay, who he was or who he might have been, and the only way I could do that was trying to figure out who am I and who would I have been, and that was a way to kind of access the character. I'm also super interested in the uncanny and the whole notion of the uncanny, especially, and I think maybe this is what my next project will be, maybe, specifically, the racialized body within the horror tradition and queer bodies within the horror tradition, because for so long, racialized and queer bodies with disabilities, they're the scary thing, they are the monster in the dark, but what happens when you are that person? What actually is scary? What is actually uncanny? And so I think that's probably what I'll be looking at. Anyway, so the upshot of that is that for a long time, the scarab from Jupiter was Dracula. I had Dracula as the book he was carrying around. For a while, I had him carrying around the Beetle. But those books, they've got their own stories attached to them. And I know, being an English major, hanging out with English majors, that there would be English majors who would try to look up the book, and that they would try to read my book through that book. So I thought, I'm just going to make up the book. So, but I love that people are trying to Google the scarab.
I did.
Oh. Excellent.
I mean, I have to ask if you have any, if the panels have any questions for you, or.
I think you have one, no?
I don't.
Okay. I was looking at your face.
I have a question for Chloe.
Oh no. Okay.
Can you talk about how you wrote your poem? So what did you?
Oh,
what was your
it's
process?
just because I thought of writing like a regular piece, but it was just all coming in fragments. So I thought it made more sense to write a poem. But it was a challenge for me to write a poem directly in English. It's the first time I've ever done that. So I tried to work. Oh, yeah, I've tried to work on repetition, and also because he was doing so much repetition through the book. So I thought of that and what it was doing to me as a reader. And so, yeah, around that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I do have to say, as a parting thought, like that poem, and again, all this discussion has really informed my reading of the novel and my understanding of it, and it's given me a lot to think about going forward, really. But unfortunately, without further ado, we do have to put an end to this panel. Oh no. And so we'll just hand it off to Sarah and Caitlin.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona and Rose, and to our whole panel. That was just a great discussion, very engaging. I loved hearing all the thoughts. Although this marks the end of our formal programming, we are excited to invite you to join us just outside these doors in a few moments for a short reception.
And I'll explain a couple of things that we have available out there for the reception. So if there are some thoughts that you guys still have about the things we just discussed, feel free to go find our panelists out there and ask them any questions that you have. Putting you guys a little bit on the spot. We also have some snacks available, so be sure to check that out. And then there's also a cash bar. And then this is maybe my favorite part. If you want to get to know Baxter for yourself, we also have books for sale. So make your way over to that table and purchase a book, and then make your way over to Suzette, and maybe she'll sign it for you. I know we're going to do some signings for maybe 15 to 20 minutes, so yeah, stay tuned for that.
And finally, we just want to draw your attention to a charity that Suzette wanted to honor for tonight, and that is the Center for Young Black Professionals. It's a charity based in Toronto. And so as organizers of the Giller Prize event, we hope to do as much good as possible with this event. With this mindset, we are excited to incorporate an opportunity for attendees to make charitable donations to the Center for Young Black Professionals. You can do this either at the event via a QR code, or you can do it remotely, just on your phone. Both are through the phone. So, the Center for Young Black Professionals aims to uplift Black youth in Toronto by working with youth workforce development, education, and advocacy programs to effect system-level change. We sincerely hope that this event will positively impact each and every attendee while giving them a chance to pay the positivity forward. If you wish to make a donation, there's more information about this charity in your programs.
And yeah, I just wanted to say thanks again to everyone for attending this event. It's been super exciting for us and the rest of our class who's here today to kind of watch it come to life. So just thank you so much for being in attendance tonight.
And actually, finally, we would like to give a special thanks to Rob from Kingston Soundworks, the whole crew of folks from Novel Idea who came out for us, as well as Daphna Rabinovich from the Scotiabank Giller Prize Foundation for making this whole event possible for us. So thanks, everyone.
Can I keep
Oh
that?
no, you know what? I was looking at the back. The students were like gesturing frantically.
Thank you.